Hey everyone, it's Sevi. After quite some anticipation ever since his first appearance in version 1.1, former Harbinger Scaramouche is finally playable as Wanderer. Although he fell from godhood, he's finally risen with a brand new flying mechanic to step on us hard. So to help you learn how to make the best of him, this guide will cover his kit, gameplay tips, best artifacts, weapons, and teams. I know we've waited long enough to finally play him, so let's get straight to it.
Call me whatever you like. Go ahead. Let me see what you can come up with.
Wanderer is mainly an on-field anemo DPS that relies more on dealing raw anemo damage rather than swirls. While his main purpose is to be a hypercarry, he can also function as an on-field driver role in some team comps. To understand his playstyle better, we'll start with his kit and talents. Wanderer's normal attacks consist of a 3-hit combo, with his charge attack having a wider AoE and the ability to stagger some light enemies. His normal attacks deal fast, spammable damage, but you can also combine his normal and charged attacks into a combo. There are some cases where spamming normal attacks more can be better, like if you're using his signature weapon which buffs only normal attacks. But otherwise you can weave in charged attacks to further optimize his damage and even stagger certain enemies. But his auto attacks are meant to be used well under the wind-favored state, which is through using his skill. In this mode, his normal and charged attacks get buffed. They'll deal more damage, have a larger AoE, and his charged attacks no longer consume stamina. He will also start hovering and get a new stamina bar, making him the first character to have actual flight mechanics. This adds some verticality to his movement now, letting you completely avoid low enough ground attacks or aid in exploration. It lasts as long as you still have stamina, or if you end it manually by pressing the skill again. The stamina bar gets consumed over time just by hovering and attacking, and if you do other actions like sprint or levitate higher, it consumes a bigger chunk. You'll notice too that he can't switch out well in flight, which means that if you need to prematurely switch to another teammate, you'd have to manually press the skill to end it. Some off-field abilities will follow him upward, like Kaya's Burst or Cookie's Skill, which can still hit some enemies within reach or trigger Dendro cores respectively if you stay low enough. But others will stay ground level, like Xiangling's Burst, which can be convenient. Anyway, Wanderer also generates energy during this state by hitting enemies with normal or charged attacks, but it seems to have a cooldown of about 2.5 seconds. On average, he'll get 4, sometimes 5 particles from his skill duration if you can keep attacking consistently. Related to his skill are his 1st and 4th Ascension passives. His A1 passive grants him additional buffs if he comes into contact with certain elements upon using his skill. Hydro makes him get 20 more skill stamina points, which can extend his maximum hovering duration. Pyro increases his attack. Cryo increases his crit rate, and Electro lets his attacks generate a bit of energy. You can see what elements you absorbed by the glowing markers on his back, and before C4, you can get up to 2 buffs. Among these buffs, I'd say Pyro and Cryo are the most significant boosts to his damage, as they give quite a lot of attack and crit rate. Electro is more about addressing his energy needs, which can be an okay bonus, but as I'll discuss later, his energy needs don't have to be demanding in the first place. Then as for Hydro, it's most useful when certain teams depend on him as an on-field driver for your party's abilities. The elemental buffs you get will mainly depend on your team comp anyway, since they can apply the element for Wanderer to absorb, but it's also possible to absorb an element from your surroundings, or if enemies have self-applied elements like slimes, which you can use to your advantage. If there are 3 or 4 elements around him to absorb, the priority of absorption is Pyro, Hydro, Electro, then Cryo. On the other hand, his A4 passive creates another source of damage. Whenever you do normal or charged attacks during his skill uptime, you have a 16% chance to get the descent effect. The chance increases by 12% each time you don't get it. This is one more reason why attack speed buffs are nice, because they help obtain this effect faster. The best way to know it's ready is by this high-pitched audio cue, since it's hard to see the visual marker during battle. Once you have the effect ready, he needs to dash to activate it. This dash won't consume stamina, and it fires 4 wind arrows that deal anemo damage based on his attack. This adds a layer to his combat gameplay. If you want to maximize the number of times this can trigger, you have to be conscious of listening and dashing to proc it, as you have to consume the effect before getting it again. This isn't really something you have to always do perfectly, so there is some gain if you learn to take advantage of it. More importantly, it lets you dash around the battlefield without expending stamina. Moving on, his burst is actually very simple. As many have long been craving for, he steps on the player, which then unleashes 5 rapid instances of anemo damage in an AoE. Light enemies get briefly launched in the air, and if there are any elements applied on them, he can swirl and/or spread them around for a bit more damage. Casting his burst will also automatically end his skill state if he's in it. The burst costs 60 energy and has a 15-second cooldown, so one consideration is if you should build him with enough energy recharge to burst every rotation, but this can mean trading off attack and crit stats, which isn't necessarily worth it. The easiest and generally recommended route is to just focus on building attack and crit stats and leave his ER stat so that he can burst every other rotation instead. Since Wanderer's damage mostly comes from his auto-attack combos, he doesn't lose that much by only bursting occasionally. Of course, there are ways to make his burst have consistent uptime. Aside from building ER, you can have more anemo batteries in the team, equip energy-generating builds like Favonius weapons or an exile artifact set on a teammate, activate the double electro-resonance, and so on. If you're in a scenario where your team or enemy particles can provide enough energy to burst consistently, then that's good. But again, there's no need to sweat trying to cast it every rotation. For his talent priority, there's one particular aspect to clarify. You'll see in his skill's talent description how much it increases his normal and charged attack damage. But note that his attacks still scale from his normal attack talent level, whether he's using his skill or not. The skill increase is a separate multiplier, much like how Yoimiya works, which means that leveling up his normal attack talent is still vital and is even a bigger damage boost than leveling up his skill. Basically, prioritize his normal attack talent first, then you can follow it up with his skill and burst. Overall, his gameplay is fairly straightforward. You set up your team's abilities before switching into him and using his skill, attacks, and burst to deal anemo damage. You do your preferred attack combos, dash every now and then to activate his wind arrows, and you can burst before using his skill or after it ends if you have the energy. His main role will be a Hypercarry DPS, which means that his team's priority is to support him so that he can do the most damage. However, he doesn't necessarily always have to deal the majority of the team damage. He can also work in conjunction with other off-field DPSs as an anemo driver. These will be discussed more later in the team section.
You aren't worried about making me more powerful? Alright.
Now let's see what his constellations add. C1 is a damage boost by increasing his attack speed and the damage from his wind arrows. The attack speed increase lets him deal more attacks, but it also means he can trigger wind arrows more often. Since C1 lets his wind arrows deal more damage now, other forms of attack speed buffs also become a bit more valuable since they can increase the chance of getting wind arrows. C2 basically means that you get a damage increase to his burst depending on how much of his stamina you've consumed while in his skill form. It's 4% per point difference, and the max you can get is 200%. This is quite a significant buff to his burst damage, but it doesn't necessarily mean you now have to force using it every rotation if it's really inconvenient or you're lacking the energy for it. Just make sure that when you do use it, it's right before his skill stamina bar expires. Otherwise, you won't get the damage bonus buff. C3 increases his burst level by 3. C4 simply means that when you activate his A1 passive, you get a random buff that hasn't been triggered yet, and that you can now get a maximum of 3 buffs. Because of the element of randomness, it can be inconsistent when trying to determine its usefulness and damage increase depending on different situations. C5 increases his skill level by 3, and C6 simply gives a big damage boost. During his skill state, normal attacks create an additional source of anemo damage, and when he falls under 40 stamina points, his hits allow him to regenerate a limited amount of stamina. As always, don't be pressured to pull for 5-star constellations. These constellations are essentially just damage boosts, and Wanderer's kit already feels complete without them.
The wind is blowing this way. What did you do?
Moving on, let's discuss how we can best build Wanderer, starting with artifacts. For his artifact stats, he'll want an attack percent sands, anemo damage bonus goblet, and a crit circlet. As for substats, getting crit and attack stats is your main priority. Getting EM isn't ideal, but it's not completely wasted since he does deal some reaction damage on the side. ER substats are also not a priority unless you are really targeting to consistently burst per rotation. If you want to reliably burst every rotation, his ER stat can range from 160 to 200%. This can go lower if you have additional sources of energy generation, like Favonius weapons, batteries, the Exile set, and so on, or if you're up against an enemy mob that drops a lot of particles. But as I mentioned before, prioritizing that much ER to cover the cost is not worth the trade-off for offensive stats. Then for his sets, there's actually a shocking twist. Brace yourselves. Wanderer's best in slot set isn't the Wanderer's Troop. But anyway, there are two main routes to go with his build. The first and more common route is building him as a Hypercarry DPS. For that, he has a variety of sets to choose from. To start, the Desert Pavilion is a brand new artifact which is obviously tailor-made for his element and playstyle, giving not just a huge damage buff, but also increased attack speed. It's no surprise that this is his best in slot. Generally speaking, it's noticeably stronger than other sets, assuming equal stat comparisons. You may also have pre-existing sets on hand which can do the job, but if you really want the highest ceiling, then this is his set to farm. Make sure that you do a charged attack before his normal attack combos in order to trigger the 4-piece effect first. Coming up next, the Shimenawa set is a strong alternative that synergizes with his playstyle, and more importantly, efficiently shares a domain with a 4-piece emblem set. You would have to deal with losing energy upon casting your skill, but if you just plan to burst every other rotation with Wanderer, then it's not that big of a deal. The Echo set is another good alternative that complements his fast attack playstyle. Unfortunately, if you're not aware of this yet, it's been established that playing with a high ping negatively affects the RNG chances, so just steer clear of this if that's the case. Of course, a 2-piece combo of attack sets or anemo damage bonus sets are very viable, and you can have more flexibility to get amazing substats on them. Retracing Bolide is viable, but requires a shielder to get the damage buff. It won't have the highest damage output, but it can at least add comfort by allowing shields to last longer on him. However, its domain is less efficient to farm, and your artifact strongbox can be spent on better sets, so I would only recommend it if you already have a set of this in the first place. One last very niche option is the Blizzard Strayer set, but only when he's in a freeze team. On this set, you'll want to avoid crit rate weapons, as that could cause him to overcap the stat. Alternatively, there are teams where he isn't necessarily the biggest damage contributor. An example is comping him in the national team, where Xiangling and Xingqiu make up a huge portion of the damage. Another example is in a taser team with Xingqiu, Fischl, or Beidou, where all three of them contribute a lot of damage together. In that case, a 4-piece Viridescent set will help your team output higher damage because of its resistance shred benefiting other teammates. You will see lower damage numbers on Wanderer, but you will end up increasing your overall team damage. This is something that some players might be hesitant to do if they're really looking for his green numbers, but it is a good example of trading an individual unit's DPS to boost your team's overall DPS.
You think I've got a sharp tongue? I just tell it like it is.
Now let's take a look at Wanderer's viable weapons. He mainly wants weapons that give crit, attack, and compatible damage bonuses. As discussed before, ER weapons aren't as desired. Let's start with his best free-to-play options. The top craftable weapon is the Mappa Mare, mainly for its relatively high base attack and elemental damage bonus buff. While its secondary stat is EM, which doesn't benefit him as much, at least it's not completely wasted when he does swirl damage. If you've been around long enough, the limited event weapon Dodoko Tails is also a viable free option. Since its buffs are related to charged attacks, this incentivizes you to use normal and charged attack combos. Another free-to-play option is also the Black Cliff Agate, which gives a good amount of crit damage and attack, but needs the user to kill enemies to get its full potential. However, it requires Star Glitter to purchase, and I personally wouldn't recommend using the very limited currency to buy weapons in the shop. Moving up with 4-star choices. If you are on the Battle Pass, the Solar Pearl is another great 4-star weapon. Note though that the normal attack buff requires you to use his skill or burst, and it only has a 6-second duration. This means that there will be some downtime if you complete his usual 10-second skill uptime. And last among the 4 stars is the Widsith, which unsurprisingly is his top 4-star weapon. At high refinements, it can compete with 5-star options. Out of the 3 random buffs it gives, you want either the attack percent or elemental damage bonuses. Since Wanderer doesn't really want EM stats, getting the EM buff will be significantly worse. Then for his 5-star choices. Tuletula's Remembrance is Wanderer's signature weapon and generally his best in slot weapon. It's best used for spamming normal attacks since it has an NA damage bonus and speed buff. If you don't have the Primos or would like to save, the Lost Prayers is a more accessible but also very good 5-star weapon if you manage to get one. Since Wanderer will have a long field time, he takes good advantage of the weapon stacking effect. It's also best used with Bennett, so his high attack buff balances the damage bonus multiplier and crit value the weapon gives. Then, Kagura's Verity is an alternative crit damage weapon. However, Wanderer's attacks in his flying state aren't considered as skill damage, making him unable to stack its passive effect, so it becomes more of a crit stat stick. Lastly, the Skyward Atlas and Memory of Dust are solid 5-star attack percent weapons that shine more when Wanderer isn't comped with Bennett, and can even outperform Kagura's Verity. Just note that the Memory of Dust will want a shielder to take full advantage of its effect.
Although I can be of help to you, seeing me as an ally is still a dangerous endeavor.
Finally, let's take a look at Wanderer's team comps. I'm going to discuss his teams a bit differently from how I normally do. Instead of giving team templates, I'm mainly going to discuss what roles and units to watch out for when making his team. To get it out of the way, if you really want Wanderer's personal damage to shine, then Farazan is a must. After all, she is the Anemo support released alongside Wanderer. Her abilities are centered around buffing Anemo characters, and she is one of the rare ways you can shred the enemy's Anemo resistance. So hopefully in the process of pulling for Wanderer, you will get her and even Constellations. Be warned though that Farazan has some clunky gameplay mechanics, high ER needs, and useful Constellation locked effects that might affect your experience. I will cover these more in her own guide video. Assuming you do have her in the team, that just leaves you 2 free slots that are flexible enough to adapt to your preferences or needs. That being said, Wanderer can still have teams without her. If so, his personal damage won't be as high, but you can make up for it by adding other DPSs in the team or using other buffers. Let's go through several categories of teammates that are recommended or compatible with Wanderer. First, one huge consideration from my experience is having a support that can protect him. He can take a lot of damage during his field time, and worse, he is very vulnerable to getting staggered, since he has no innate means of increasing his resistance to interruption. Getting interrupted too much will really affect his DPS output, and if you try dodging a lot to avoid attacks, he expends more stamina, which reduces his skill uptime. This issue can be addressed by having a shielder, or having units that provide an interruption resistance buff. Layla, Diona, Toma, or Tenkfei are pretty good shield picks, and since they can let you get the cryo or pyro related buff from his passive. Of course, there's the reliable Zhongli for his shield, which also shreds Anemo resistance. Units that aren't inherently shielders but can give him interruption resistance are Xingqiu and Beidou. For healers, there are a lot to choose from, some of which offer more than just healing. You could risk not having any of these survival utilities, but that could be a more difficult experience. If you're confident with survivability, you can then add supports that will buff his damage. Bennett is easily one of the best options to complement Wanderer's hypercarry role. Aside from healing, he gives a huge attack buff and enables Wanderer to get the pyro-related passive buff. Yunjin's normal attack damage buff synergizes with Wanderer's playstyle. Candace or Ayato's abilities, or constellations like Toma or Yunjin's, also give a normal attack buff. If you happen to have a C4 gene which can shred Anemo resistance by 40%, that's a significant boost to Wanderer's Anemo damage. She benefits from Farazan's abilities too and can contribute Anemo particles and even Fav particles. She also has that Sunfire combo with Bennett that you can comp with Wanderer. Then you can consider units that also do off-field damage. There's so many options with their own pros and cons, so I won't bother trying to go through them one by one. It mainly depends on what you have, which characters are built, if you're trying to counter certain elements, and if you want to target specific buffs from Wanderer's passive. Some combos of course yield additional reactions that can add more team synergy, such as combining a Hydro and Cryo to freeze enemies, or Hydro and Electro for Electro Charge. Another option is to slot in an Anemo grouper, which is a huge help against certain enemy mobs. Wanderer doesn't suck enemies in, and even Farazan's suction is pretty weak. So in those cases, units like Kazuha, Venti, or even Sucrose can help set up enemies for Wanderer's AoE damage. Another Anemo unit also helps with energy generation, which might help in making Wanderer and Farazan able to burst consistently on cooldown. You might be considering double Geo double Anemo, similar to Xiao's double Geo composition. This can feel comfy considering the Geo resonance, and if you're using premium Geo characters like Zhongli and Albedo. But remember that Wanderer doesn't absorb any buffs from Geo, so either you just settle for that or rely on environmental elements he can absorb. Wanderer can still operate without Farazan, of course, which slightly widens his team options. In that case, he can still be an on-field carry, but he can also become more of a driver for your team's off-field abilities. One caveat though is that he lacks grouping mechanics, unlike Sucrose, who's great for grouping, or even Hazo, who still has a bit of suction. There are many existing team templates that incorporate an Anemo driver, National, Taser, or Freeze to name a few. As an on-field driver and solo Anemo unit, the VV set will likely be more beneficial to buff his entire team. He can also be used in Dendro teams. As a Hypercarry unit, Wanderer doesn't gain anything from Dendro, but as a driver for Dendro-related teams, he's functional, though he doesn't necessarily add anything unique. For one, he has the option of driving Xingqiu or Yelan in Hyperbloom or Burgeon teams. He can also work in an Aggravate team with 2 Electros, which are ideally Fischl and Beidou, and a Dendro. He shreds Electro resistance with VV, still outputs personal damage, while also triggering some Aggravate damage through swirls on the side. Anyway, there are units I haven't mentioned by name, but are still applicable to fill in the aforementioned roles. At the end of the day, you just want to make sure that you have something that will keep Wanderer and your team alive, then you can either go for units that further increase Wanderer's damage or provide their own damage. All in all, Wanderer can appeal to those who want to add a 5-star Anemo Hypercarry to their roster. From a meta perspective, there aren't a lot of extremely compelling reasons to pull for him as of now. Whether that changes in the future remains to be seen. Regardless, I'm sure a lot of players have waited so long for him to finally be playable, and if you're one of them, I hope you enjoy flying with and getting stepped on by our wandering boy. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all soon. Take care.
I'm trying to figure out a way to get rid of you, so I can go commit atrocities. Wait, did you think I was being serious?